This is how the documents were found. As in so many attics and in so many basements, these treasures lie untouched and forgotten. In this one, Donnie's memories unfolded. Each and everything that he had basically partaken in his life was there to be found. This is Donnie in the late 1930s, early 1940s. He had been attending college in Illinois, Iola. And the interesting thing is that just like every other young man, here he was pining away, thinking about adventure, thinking about dating, thinking about everything he possibly could do. A graffiti in one of his notebooks that he would have sat doing his studies, dreaming of ultimately joining the fight and becoming part of the solution to a growing threat. As ultimately the documents were pulled out one after another, we soon started to see more. Donnie had been a member of the 1st Marine Division, and now we saw that while he was waiting to deploy to the Pacific, he had actually taken a course in Japanese. Here was a young man who felt that he could use his intellect and his capabilities to ultimately break the codes and be able to utilize his knowledge to do field interrogations or to be able to immediately assess seizures in the field of maps and or Japanese documents that could change the tide and course of a battle. Ultimately, he put every bit of effort that he had in his regular studies into becoming very fluent in Japanese. As we basically went along into the book, it became even more personal. From his basic training photo with the Marine Corps, ultimately, here we have 1943 San Diego, his graduation photo. With all the names of his friends, suddenly I realized there was not much difference between Donnie and myself when I went to the infantry school of Fort Benning. The names that you will soon forget over time, at that moment, these are your brothers. There is no doubt that these people are closer than many relatives are. And there in the upper right is Private Don Cuny, USMC, November 18th, 1943. And the names of so many men. And you wonder what was the fate of every one of them. Along with the photos came many of these booklets. During the training sessions, you would see photos taken from the field, names of friends now well gone. Did they survive? Did they make it to the 1950s? Did they perish in Peleliu, Guadalcanal? Ultimately, where would they move on to life? So many questions come about from these things. So many people you wish you knew more about. But so much you get to learn about people like Donnie. As we continued on into the book, into the box, you can see pretty much now the reality of what was happening and what would ultimately be the fate of Don. 1st Marine Division, ultimately the presidential citation for those that served during the Battle of Peleliu. One of these from the Secretary of Navy. Ultimately here to show the family what fight that Donnie had ultimately been involved in. With that, as we had talked about before, now the picture of Donnie, copies of his death notification, ultimately showing that he was killed in action on Peleliu. Here was the face of that young, vibrant, and wonderful man that wanted to make a difference in the world. As the photos showed before, one of the most ominous photos of Peleliu, that of the cemetery of which the chaplain for 1st Marine Division would ultimately go forward and take photos by every grave marker so that every family would know where their sons lied until their bodies could be repatriated someday. Then the ominous aspect of notification to the family from the Marine Corps identifying that Donnie was killed September 18, 1944, against the enemy in the service of his country in Peleliu. It is one of those documents that does not do service to what that silver star that sat in the shack, in the cabin that day, that caught my attention. Ultimately, more and more research would lead towards understanding more and more about what had happened. A framed document from the Commandant's office from 1948 that would have ultimately accompanied the Silver Star being issued to Donnie's mother. And here it was showing ultimately the Private First Class Donnie A. Cuny, U.S. Marine Corps, had died in action against Japanese forces in Peleliu on 18 September 1944. Due to his action in combat, he was issued and awarded the Silver Star Medal with the citation by the President of the United States. So many things came about from this box, from the continuing to dig deeper into this man's life. His scorebook for his M1 Garand, ultimately the weapon that he would carry into battle with him, then also the M1903 bolt action with grenade launcher that we had discussed earlier. So many things, so many amazing pieces of history. His black book with friends, girlfriends, names of those who have passed. All of these treasure troves of items sat untouched for years. Books that ultimately the family would collect over time to show what and be able to understand what sacrifice their son had given. In the box was identified a book on Peleliu, an exact debrief printed in the 1950s by the Marine Corps, ultimately going into the background and the history. This treasure trove of knowledge, this ability to be able to understand what lay ahead during this battle, what did Donnie face as far as Japanese defenses, and what was the importance for these island hopping missions to deny the Japanese bases, to be able to deny them their eyes and ears, to stop the ultimate onslaught that would cause them to finally surrender in 1945. As we went along and started looking at each and every one of these pages, it became apparent of the sacrifice and of the challenges that lie ahead. One of the things that struck me during the research into this was found on page 52, showing that airfield and the Japanese tank infantry that had occurred. During the research, we identified that Private First Class Donald Cuny was a member of Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine. He had been there on the D-Day of Peleliu on 15 September 1944, and at 9:45 a.m. had come ashore at the beaches, White Beach to be exact. Ultimately, at 16:50 hours, while moving north from the southern landing zones, during the course of the movement on the southern part of the island, this is where Donnie's unit would ultimately make a move towards a Japanese airfield, a key piece of infrastructure to help the Army Air Corps and Navy to be able to stage aircraft for attacks, reconnaissance, as well as supply missions. In the packet as well came this small little envelope. What we would see is out of this small little envelope came photos of that battle. Photos that ultimately would depict the landing, that would show the conditions, the airfield in which Donnie would make the ultimate sacrifice to save members of his Echo Company by stepping out of cover to engage a Japanese machine gun tank. Ultimately, these sacrifices were committed not for glory, not for any form of fame or fortune, but simply to save his brothers. It is one of those things that out of the simple box, out of all of these items forgotten to time, a man's history unfolded, a short and amazing history as it was.
I thank you for joining me. The captain thanks you for joining me, and we will see you soon.